Okay, friends, welcome today back to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And we're beginning a new chapter today, chapter 45. And we've gone through this passage of a few chapters now where we've looked at the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers after all the water that's gone under the bridge. And I'm asking today, the question is, what is it that makes true reconciliation possible? So I think we'll be about 2 days working through chapter 45, and then hopefully we can draw some answers out of it. But the thing I'd like to say to begin with is just how easy it is to get angry and how easy it is to hold a grudge against someone and to be unforgiving. It's easy to become angry, especially when someone wrongs you. It's very easy not only to get anger, but for that anger to grow into resentment and bitterness. Bitterness then can lead to becoming alienated from not just those people, but other people as well. Modern day psychologists say that one of the biggest causes of anxiety is people who become isolated from other people. You see, alienation is seen to produce anxiety, apprehension, which often will then grow and metastasize, a bit like a cancer, into an out and out hostile attitude to other people, which then can make people get trapped in a spiral where they become more and more alienated from those around him, which of course makes reconciliation all the more impossible. And in the most severe cases, for some people, it grows into an out and out paranoia in their attitude towards other people. But the question I'm asking today is, if you're in that situation where you're isolated, feeling alienated from other people, maybe it's just that one person who's wronged you in your family, what is it that would make a true heartfelt reconciliation possible? Even accepting that you have good reason to be angry and bitter, what can you do to move from a place of unforgiveness to forgiveness, to remove and reduce the need for you to feel anxious or apprehensive? And also, really, how is it possible for us even to want to be reconciled if we get trapped into that spiral of negative thinking? Well, I believe the answer to that question and many others can be found in this life of this man who we've been going through, this guy Joseph, who's experienced a horrendous, hideous, horrible injustices as he's gone through life. But we can learn from the way that he has handled these situations. What it says about the way he handled these things, I believe, can teach us how to handle things, particularly when we're the victims of an injustice, particularly when things that have happened to us that would tend to make us angry and bitter. How might we also be able to manage these kind of negative emotions and actually get something positive out of it in the fullness of time? Now, of course, the person I'm talking about here is Joseph, in the story contained in the book of Genesis. And today, as I said at the introduction, we're beginning to look at a new chapter, chapter 45. And we're going to look at it from the point of view of what are the basis for reconciliation that we have witnessed across these last few chapters. But before we launch out into the new chapter, which we'll be in, I think, for a couple of days, I'll just want us to briefly review what's happened up to this point, because it all needs to sit within the context of the greater story. It's very important that you understand that the several chapters before this, and you understand what's going on if you hope to understand what actually comes to pass in this chapter. So as you may recall, Joseph had 11 brothers, and when they were younger, they became jealous of him, and they sort of plotted together and decided to get rid of him. To make a rather long story short, they sold him to slave traders who were heading to Egypt, and because of that, he ended up in Egypt, where he was in fact indeed sold and became a slave. And then, to make the next episode in his life relatively short, because there's a lot goes on, once a slave in the guy's called Potiphar's household, he unjustly got thrown into jail, but through some interesting, amazing turn of events, he rose from being prisoner to prime minister in the land of Egypt. He went from zero to hero in a single day. He became appointed to the second highest position in the land, only subject to the authority of Pharaoh himself. Now, in his early life as a young man, he had had dreams, and one particular dream was that he predicted that he would rise to such a position of authority. And it is within this story we see how that eventually indeed come to pass. Now, in order to rise to that position, he found himself in a situation where he interpreted a dream that Pharaoh was having and was troubling him, which meant the interpretation of that dream was that there was going to be 7 years of plenty in the land, and then there would be 7 years of famine. And none of Pharaoh's expert advisors were able to offer him any help in what the dreams had made. And sure enough, there was indeed 7 years of plenty. And it was Joseph himself who was put in charge of the plan whereby they should arrange to store the food during the good times in order to prepare for the 7 years of famine. And when the famine hit, it hit the whole region hard. And the brothers who are still back in Canaan, they were sent by their father and told, go down to Egypt and try and buy some food. And it was this strange, twisted story of circumstances that they actually end up standing before their own brother Joseph. They're standing before the same brother that they actually sold into slavery 21 years earlier. But they didn't recognize Joseph at the time. He had grown up, obviously. He would have looked different. He would have been dressed in Egyptian clothes, and he, we are told, spoke through an interpreter. He would be dressed in Egyptian garb related to his very high position, and the last thing they would have expected to see was this brother of theirs 20 years later, in effect the prime minister or the vice president, if you like, of the entire land of Egypt, the highest official in the land. And of course, it's very likely they would have just assumed that he had died at some point. So through this amazing set of events, this situation has come to pass. Now, Joseph kept back one of his brothers in Egypt when he sent the others back with the food. But following other twists and turns in the story, the father reasonably became very skeptical of the idea of sending anyone back to retrieve the brother that Joseph had insisted they leave behind, because of course he was afraid he might lose more of his children into slavery in Egypt. But eventually the famine got so severe for Jacob and his family, finally he said, all right, you guys go back and try and get us some food again. So when they come back into Egypt, another long series of events take place, but the bottom line is the story is they're all here, these brothers, and they're all standing before Joseph again, and at this point they don't know who he is. Now one of the brothers, Judah, he had promised their father Israel, or Jacob was his old name, Israel he's called now, that he would absolutely bring Benjamin back, because Israel's real fear that he would lose his youngest son Benjamin when he previously lost his favourite son Joseph 20 odd years ago. So Judah promised that he would ensure that Benjamin came back. But Joseph had set Benjamin up for this supposed theft that he had occurred, and he was holding on to him. So they're now standing before Joseph with the possibility of having to return to their father without Benjamin, and that was the worst possible scenario for him. But then we see a dramatic thing happens. So this is the point where I've told you we're arriving at chapter 45, but let me just remind you, before we begin 45, I'd like to read again the concluding verses of chapter 44, when Judah speaks up, and this is quite amazing. Judah is speaking now, and he says, "Now then, please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, and let the boy return with his brothers. How can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? No, do not let me see that misery come upon my father." So he's already told Joseph that if the brothers go back to Canaan without Benjamin, that it would kill their father. Literally bring his grey hairs down to the grave is that lovely old-fashioned saying that's used to describe the catastrophic effect it would have on their dad. So Judah then decides he's going to step up and say, "I'll tell you what, I'll become your slave, Joseph. Keep me, but just send Benjamin back. You see, I promised my father I'd get Benjamin back to him. So keep me and send in his place and send him back, please. Now keep in mind that these are the same brothers who sold Joseph into slavery, a really obnoxious bunch of guys 20 odd years ago. And Joseph had every right to be angry with them. It would have been totally natural for him to have been bitter with them after all they had done to him. He could have been vindictive. He could have chose to publish them. He could have chose to punish them. But what Judah offers to do in standing up and substituting himself for his brothers, well, it really affects Joseph. It really gets to him. Because here we see these jealous brothers, the ones who originally sold him into slavery, now, in a sense, completely demonstrating that through this situation and the recent events, that they've changed, that they're trustworthy, and that to some extent there's clearly a degree of repentance. And now going way beyond that, one of them is willing to stand up and to offer to sacrifice himself to protect his younger brother. And this action of Judah prompts an overwhelming response from Joseph. And the text tells us, then Joseph could no longer control himself before all his attendants, and he cried out, have everyone leave my presence. So there, with no one with Joseph, when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer because they were terrified at his presence. So at last Joseph makes himself known to them. I'm sure if you've been going through the text from either together these last few weeks, you've been thinking, when is this all going to unravel? When's Joseph actually going to say who he is, stand up and admit who he is? Now, people who understand the original language in the Bible text, they suggest that he was probably speaking Egyptian prior to this point, but then at this point it switches to Hebrew to them. So that way it's unmistakable. Then he tells them who he is and what he is saying, and they're very clear of who he really was. Also, for him to say, I am Joseph, and then immediately ask, how is their father doing? That also sort of backs that perspective up and gives the game away. He knew his father was still alive because he asked that earlier, but he's bringing it up again, indicating that he wants to know if he's well enough. I suspect he wants to know if he's well enough so he can make plans for them to travel there, to come to Egypt, so the whole family can be reconciled with him. But you've got to remember the brothers' situation. They're dumbfounded. They thought this guy was dead years ago, and here he is, the high official in Egypt. They just couldn't fathom it. And verse 3 says they don't even answer him. They're so terrified in his presence. Now that Hebrew word translated, maybe terrified or dumbfounded in your translation, whichever version of the Bible you're looking at, the original Hebrew word means disturbed, alarmed, anxious, nervous, afraid, all of those things. So these poor brothers are really terrified, and they're standing there unable to speak, struck dumb. But much more than that, they are very afraid as well. That's what the text is telling us. And of course, they're afraid at this point because they know this is the younger brother, the guy they sold into slavery, the younger brother they betrayed. And they're probably thinking, what will he do to us? And they're helpless, so to speak. In this situation, he now has all the power, and he could literally order them to be killed on the spot. So they just stand there in silence, terrified, anxious, nervous about what would come next. Well, let's see what comes next. Verse 4. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed. Do not be angry with yourselves for selling me, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God had sent me ahead of you to preserve you for a remnant on earth, and to save your lives for a great deliverance. So then it is not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now, this is an amazing little speech he's giving to his brothers. And what he's basically saying, it really wasn't you who were behind all this. Maybe you thought it was you. What I'm saying is that this is very important because God chose it. And you've got to notice, if you look at these 4 verses, verses 4 to 8, 3 times in his explanation, he refers to the fact that God did these things. Look at this. For God sent me ahead of you to save lives. Verse 7, but God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save the lives by great deliverance. Wow, that's saying it was actually so that God's full salvation plan for all of mankind could be fulfilled through the nation of Israel. And for that to happen, this remnant needed to be saved on this occasion. And then at verse 8, it says again, so then it was not you who sent me here, but God. And by the way, the use of the term that he was risen to this position of Lord of the household in verse 8 is a term that means he was actually a sort of pastoral advisor. It's a word that almost means that he's got this role as a parental figure. In other words, Pharaoh will listen to him and his role is to give advice. So a pagan king has a Hebrew believer, a believer in Yahweh, the one God Most High, as his spiritual pastoral advisor. That's amazing. But I do want you to notice that 3 times he says to them, it was not you, it was the Lord that was behind this. So let me just pause at this point and make an observation. And let me ask you the question, is Joseph bitter here? Is he angry? If not, why not? Well, the answer to that is he sees the discerning hand of God. The discerning hand of God in these events is visible to him. Even though they had done something wrong to him, even though in fact you could call what they did evil, you could call it wicked, you could even call it horrific, yet he was able to see beyond that and see that God could even use human wickedness, the thing that they had committed against him, to bring about good. That's incredible. That's an incredible truth, and that's an incredible perspective for Joseph to have the insight to have. So I would like to suggest that the discerning hand of God in human affairs will always be the real basis for any reconciliation that you want in your lives. I'll just repeat that because I believe it's important. Discerning the hand of God in everything that has happened to you, in all your difficult circumstances, whatever you're having to deal with, will always be the basis of all reconciliation between you and other people. He could forgive them. Joseph was able to forgive them because he understood that. He was able to be reconciled to them, not because of anything they did or they said, not because of anything he did or he said or he did or didn't do. But he could be reconciled with them because he understood that God could use anything, even something that was done wrong to him, in order to bring about good. That's a really profound thought. And I'd just like you to roll that thought around in your brain for a little while. Can I just say, that's a very different way to look at life compared to the way most people look at life. That's an unusual way to look at life, but it's a biblical way to look at life. It's an unusual way to look at things, but it's a biblical way to look at things. It's the spiritual way. And if you take that path and take that perspective, it will save you from anger, bitterness, vindictiveness. Without holding on to that perspective, all you have left when someone wrongs you is to fall back in bitterness, blame, resentment, and even, heaven forbid, revenge. The principle that is being taught here is that true spirituality perceives, sees the hand of God in the course of all events, even negative ones, and therefore enables you and enables us to forgive others when they do things that are wrong to us. No one can truly believe in the sovereignty of God in the affairs of everyday life, can still hold or bear a grudge against someone else or seek revenge. If you truly embrace that truth, it's not possible to think that way. Joseph here, yes, he confronted his brothers with the reasoned truth, but he forgivingly confronted his brothers with the spiritually coherent truth of the fact that, yes, they'd done something wrong to him, but yet still God could use it for good. If all you do in life is look at the wrongs done to you, then the natural thing is to be angry and bitter and maybe even to seek some sort of revenge or payback with people. But if you can see beyond that, if you can look beyond that and see the sovereign hand of God working in your life in every situation, then I believe you can truly find peace and seek reconciliation and offer forgiveness rather than vindictiveness and revenge. So let me just repeat what I've said. No one who believes in the sovereignty of God in the affairs of human life can reasonably bear a grudge or seek revenge. If all you do is look at the wrongs that have been done to you, then the natural thing, of course, is to be angry and bitter, and maybe even at some level to try and seek some kind of revenge. But if we can go beyond that, if we can see the sovereign hand of God working in all the circumstances in our life, then we are able to let go. We are able then to seek reconciliation, maybe even forgiveness. So in this text, he says to his brothers, I'm your brothers, and whatever you intended in the past is now irrelevant because God has taken it and used it for good. So let's continue the story and pick up in the text in verse 9, where it says, Now hurry back to my father and say to him, This is what your son Joseph says. God made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Don't delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen and be near me, and your children and your grandchildren, your flocks and your herds, and all that you have. I will provide for you there, because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise, you and your household and all that belong to you will become destitute. You can see for yourselves, and so can my brother Benjamin, that it is really I who am speaking to you. Tell my father about all the honor accorded to me in Egypt and everything that you have seen, and bring my father down here quickly. So Joseph continues this speech, and in the first part of the talk he said, Look, I know that what you did was wrong, but I saw the hand of God behind that, and his greater purpose was to preserve life. It was to preserve not just my life, but your lives and your future prosperity in the future. So now what I want you to do is go back to our father and tell him, I'm second in charge of all Egypt. Explain to him about the position of authority that I hold in Egypt, and then I want you to bring him back here because I want to take care of him and all of you. Right now there's a famine going on, but the famine is going to get worse. He points out that there's still 5 years more famine to come, and outside of his protection, they haven't got a chance. So the other option is that they can come and that he will not only protect them, but he will give them a particularly choice piece of land to live in. He has the power to do that, and he says, tell your father I can do that and I have that authority. The story continues when it tells us, then he threw his arms around his brother Benjamin and wept. And Benjamin embraced him weeping, and he kissed all his brothers and wept over them. And afterwards his brothers talked with him. So he hugs them, and then he wept with Benjamin, and Benjamin cries as well. Then he kissed his brothers, and they all wept. And then it says they talked together. Now, as I read that the first time, it really struck me as rather interesting, the order in which things happen. When people are alienated with each other and there's anger and hostility between people, what's normally the first thing that happens? Usually the first thing they want to do is talk the thing out and tell each other having explained the situation, how they can reach a point of forgiveness and then hopefully forgive each other. So it usually begins, reconciliation usually begins with someone saying, let's talk. And that's okay, but that's the first thing that we usually do. Then when you get the talking done, often you can decide to forgive each other. And I would recommend that on many occasions. Maybe at the end, people sometimes can even hug each other, maybe even have what they call a kiss and make up. And that's particularly useful in a family situation. But what's interesting to me is that's not the order in which it's done here. That really struck me that that's not what happened here. There was hugging and kissing before there was any talking, which tells me that Joseph's attitude was one of forgiveness first, at the same time always wanting reconciliation. That's an important lesson I believe we can learn. That sometimes we can just go into it for having already or are immediately been prepared to forgive other people and offer reconciliation. In this situation, and maybe for us sometimes this should be the case also, that's just what we should do. It's almost like saying there's nothing needs to be said. I have already forgiven you. And in this situation, that's what he says. And he says, I just want you and your father and the whole family down here. God sent you down here and brought you here before me in order to allow me to help you. In fact, he's actually saying to them, God sent you down here and you're standing before me now in order that I can save your lives. They're talking at this point that's described in these verses wasn't anything to do with the actual reconciliation or forgiveness. That had already been offered and taken. It was more a case of having a catch-up. There's a lot of water under the bridge since we last spoke, so let's sit down and have a talk. You see, appreciation of God's sovereign control in his circumstances produced in Joseph a character where he was immediately able to offer forgiveness and offer acceptance. Now, on the other hand, I have known many people in the past who have allowed themselves to become bitter because of the circumstances they find themselves in or because what have people done to them. But sometimes even those difficult events can be viewed and seen as all part of God's sovereign plan to bring about a greater blessing in your life. Suffering and injustice is no excuse for holding on to bitterness. Joseph didn't do any of that. Why not? Well, it tells us because he realized that God had sent him down to Egypt, sent him literally into enemy territory in the most difficult of circumstances, thrown in prison at one point. But God had allowed these things to happen, not his brothers. They may have initiated the process, but God had worked through all the challenges of Joseph's life. So now they've been reconciled. So what happens next? Verse 16. When the news reached Pharaoh's palace that Joseph's brothers had come, Pharaoh and all his officials were pleased. Pharaoh said to Joseph, tell your brothers, do this, load your animals and return to the land of Canaan, and bring your father and your families back to me. I will give you the best of the land of Egypt, and you can enjoy the fat of the land. Remember, at the beginning of this chapter, Joseph said he had told the Egyptians to clear the room, so they'd stepped outside. But what I think this is telling us, they must have heard what was going on, probably because of all the loud weeping, etc. In fact, it says that when the news got back, it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. So they were aware of what happened and they react positively to Joseph's newfound family situation. Then it says in verse 19, you also directed me to tell them, do this, take some carts from Egypt for your children and your wives, and get your father and come. Never mind about your belongings, because the best of all Egypt will be yours. Wow. This is the Pharaoh speaking here. What would make a pagan king do something like this? This is a magnanimous offer of the best of the land. So it's worth just pausing for a moment and asking, why did he do that? Well, I believe he did that because he acknowledged that it was Joseph who had saved them all. It was Joseph who had first interpreted the dream that there was going to be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. And it was Joseph who organized the storage of the grain during the good years. So Pharaoh was well aware that they were all safe and sound and had something to eat, even after 2 years of famine at this point, because of Joseph's wisdom. And I think if Joseph has a family, the least we can do is help them and allow him to bring them down here. And we'll give them, in a sense, the best seat in the house, if you like, i.e. the best portion of land, because we are grateful for what Joseph has done. The story continues in verse 21. So the sons of Israel did this. Joseph gave them carts, as Pharaoh had commanded, and he also gave them provisions for their journey. To each of them he gave new clothing, but to Benjamin he gave 300 shekels of silver and 5 sets of clothes. And this is what he sent to his father: 10 donkeys loaded with the best things of Egypt, and 10 donkeys, female donkeys, loaded with grain and bread and other provision for the journey. Then he sent his brothers away, and as they were leaving, he said to them, "Don't quarrel on the way." So because of Pharaoh's generosity and Joseph's gracious spirit, he is given wagons, and he fills them with food, and he gives them clothes, and he gives Benjamin more than all the rest. He gives him a double portion, if you like, and he sends him back to his father, and he also gives Benjamin 300 pieces of silver. He was so thrilled to be reconciled with his brother that he seemed to lavish him with gifts. And then he said to them, and this is interesting, the last thing he says as he sends them off, he says, "Don't quarrel on the way." That's interesting, isn't it? Now, one commentator I read suggests that he was saying, "Don't quarrel among yourselves," because Joseph could envision them getting out of town and then getting into arguments about all the stuff they'd done in the past. So they wouldn't have actually acknowledged and lived in the forgiveness that they had been offered. But Joseph importantly says to them, "Go and priest, don't argue among yourselves, and bring my father and the whole family, extended family, back to Egypt." So we're into the closing verses now. Verses 25 and 26 say, "So they went up out of Egypt and came to their father Jacob in the land of Canaan. And they told him, 'Joseph is alive. In fact, he's ruler of all Egypt.' Jacob was stunned, and he did not believe them." So they get back home, and they said to father, "You're not going to believe this, but Jacob's alive." And that's a shock, sure, but there's even a bigger shock when they tell him he's sort of head of administration over all Egypt. Now, in the original language, it says Jacob's heart stood still. The Hebrew word literally means numb. He is numbed, shocked, numbed by this news. He clearly would be shocked. His long-lost son Joseph is alive, and that's one thing, but telling him that he's not only alive, but he's now prime minister in the massive country of Egypt, the powerful country of Egypt, second only in command in all of Egypt to Pharaoh, that just doesn't seem possible or probable to him. And quite naturally, his explanation is, "I can't believe that." So now what are these brothers going to do? Initially, Jacob has seemed to say, "I'm not going. I don't believe this." So what are they going to do now? Well, let's look at how this chapter closes off in the last 2 verses. "But when they told him everything Joseph had said to them, and when he saw the carts Joseph had sent to carry him back, the spirit of their father Jacob revived, and Israel said, 'I'm convinced my son Joseph is alive, and I will go and see him before I die.'" Do you remember when we were back in Genesis, God changed Jacob's name to Israel? Well, the fact that he says Jacob is talking, have you noticed, it's really strange that within the same verse, the name Jacob is used, and then immediately it's switched to calling him Israel. And that must have a significance. You see, Israel is his God-given name. And in light of the fact that the text just said that he didn't believe, and then at that point the text is calling him Jacob, and he's in a state of unbelief, yet it switches to Israel when it says his spirit was revived and he believed. And this seems to indicate to me that when he sees the evidence of all the stuff that Joseph has sent and the testimony of the brothers, then he reaches a point where suddenly his spirit is revived, and he believes that the Lord has intervened. And at that point, the text switches to calling him Israel. I think that's what's going on at this point, and that's why he's called Israel again. He sees the evidence, he hears the testimony, and he believes. And he becomes convinced that his son is indeed alive, and so he agrees to go back to Egypt. So let me recap. The brothers, they are back in Canaan. They've got back home and they tell their father Joseph is alive. That was a shock, but the even bigger shock is when they tell him he's now head of all of the administration of all of Egypt. And Jacob stroke Israel at first doesn't appear to believe them and says, I'm not going back to Egypt with you. But then he hears the testimony, sees the evidence with the carts and goods laden up, ready to go, the stuff they've brought back, and he indeed becomes convinced that his son is alive. So he agrees that they can all go back to Egypt. Now, as you can imagine, where are we? We're in chapter 45, so there's a lot more stories still to unravel and unpack in this book of Genesis. This book has 50 chapters in it, another 5 to go, and we've got lots more to cover. But this little episode in the overall story about the reconciliation, I believe, illustrates for us the basis of reconciliation. So although we're going to look at the rest of this family story later, I want to pause and make a couple of observations about this section of the story. Because in this chapter we're being taught that the recognition of the hand of God in human affairs is vital to us growing in spiritual maturity. Even evil in the situation of human affairs can be seen to work God's purposes, and can be seen, an understanding of that is the thing that can make reconciliation possible, probably like nothing else. It's the only way in which we can really be in a place of peace if we're seeking reconciliation following some gross injustice that's been done to us. If you think you could never forgive people for what at that point you believe is maybe you feel they ruined your life, so to speak, then how in the world can you ever be reconciled without this perspective? In this case, we have one of the most outstanding cases of forgiveness and reconciliation illustrated for us in all of the Bible, and it's very clear that the whole reconciliation happened only because Joseph recognized the sovereign hand of God in all of the human affairs of his situation. So I'd like to make several, I believe, important observations as we close this chapter. I want to talk a bit about the story in the context of the whole Bible, because there are interesting things going on here and are illustrated for us, like you'll dig very deep in the Bible to find them in other passages. There is something you see in the Bible that's called typology, when something is identified as a type, and the concept of the type is widespread in the Bible, and its meaning is fairly straightforward. Typology simply says that something or some events that happen are a type of something else that's going to happen in the future. In other words, something is an example of something that's going to happen again. And there are some parallels between the situation that you're reading and looking at the moment and what is going to happen later in the biblical narrative or the salvation history revealed in the Bible. Many Bible students studying the book of Genesis have concluded that Joseph is a type of Christ. Now, the text does not specifically say that, but the Bible says there are types, and even the use of that word is used in a passage of 1 Peter where Peter teaches on this overall concept. Types appear regularly throughout the Old Testament. The Old Testament had a lamb, for example, and that was a type, an example of the kind of thing God wanted when it comes to the idea of sacrificial living and atonement for sin. And Jesus was the fulfillment of that type. And even John the Baptist, when he first saw Jesus, he said, "Behold, behold the Lamb of God," when he looked at him. So that's a type. Jesus was a type. The sacrificial lamb was a type of sacrifice for sin, which was fully revealed and seen in the person of Christ. Many have pointed out that what happens to Joseph in this story is also a type of Christ. And whilst we stick with types from the New Testament, there are a few cases, and this is one of them, where the evidence is overwhelming that God intended a type within the Old Testament to be noticed and applied into the New Covenant. And I think that this is one of those occasions, probably one of the strongest, most notable of those occasions. Many Bible experts would say that Jesus was a type of Christ. And that is because there are so many parallels, significant parallels that we can draw. Both were the special object of their Father's love. Both were hated by many and persecuted. Both had people react negatively to their claims of superiority, and then those same people conspired to kill them. Yet both became a blessing not only to them, but to the Gentiles, to the all nations of the world surrounding them. And both are seen to receive a Gentile bride. Joseph indeed reconciled with his persecutors and exalted them, and so will Christ. And some even make the parallel that Jacob figuratively received his son back from the dead. And of course, that's what happens when he rose from the dead. Both were not only just raised up, but they were raised up into position of authorities and became rulers over all. Jacob's response on hearing the incredibly good news prefigures, in fact, the response of the disciples when the women tell him that Christ is in fact alive and has been raised from the dead. They greet the news at first with just stunned unbelief, but finally, when they're presented with the evidence, they accept it with unspeakable joy. Their faith, like Jacob's, revived them and then reorientated their lives and made anybody who follows him pilgrims, venturing from a land plagued by famine to what we will eventually find as the best place to be, an unimaginable place for us of blessing. So somewhere along the line in studying Joseph, we need to see the parallels between what happened to him and what happened to Christ. I believe that's really important. But while that's there, the point of the chapter is that Joseph was willing to be reconciled to his brothers. That's the main point of just the single chapter 45. It wants to show that Joseph was reconciled to his brothers because he saw the sovereign hand of God in everything that had happened. A total of 4 times in this passage, in this chapter, he says the Lord is the one who allowed this to happen. He explains it to his brothers that way. He saw the loving hand of Father God behind the cruelty of his brothers, and he accepted that all that had happened to him had come about, and all he had been allowed in the will of God, and through it he had even managed to experience the blessings of God. And reconciliation is possible when there's forgiveness, and forgiveness is sometimes only possible when the circumstances are hard, if you can recognize God's sovereignty in those circumstances. I wonder if any of you listening to this have been wronged, grievously wronged. Maybe you've got angry. Maybe you're hanging on to anger. Maybe you're hanging on to resentment because of what has happened to you. Do you ever struggle and think, I will never be able to be reconciled with that person because of the attitude of my heart and how I feel about what they did to me? Well, there's something you need to consider here. Maybe it wasn't just all about your abusers. Maybe it just wasn't, all of this shouldn't be about them. Maybe you should try and see the sovereign hand of God in carrying you through it. Try and remember, not that God wanted it, but God may have allowed it. It may not have been his desire for you, but he was going to carry you through it. And yet still you can use those terrible, difficult circumstances to the greater good, because that's what God wants, and that, I believe, is what the lesson of this chapter is. Romans 8:28 says, all things work together for good for those who love God and are called according to his purposes. So friends, no matter what happens to you, no matter what someone else has done to you, you're a lot better looking out for the hand of God in it instead of being filled with hatred in your heart for those who treated you wrongly or abused you. One commentator says, reconciliation comes through forgiveness, and forgiveness comes through the recognition of God's sovereignty. When a person who has been wrong can see things as God sees them and perceive them as God's plan, then that's the basis for being able to forgive. And then reconciliation is possible where appropriate. But anyone who bears a grudge or hopes to retaliate someday has not come to appreciate the meaning of the sovereignty of God in their lives. There can be no reconciliation, there can be no peace without recognizing God can use every situation to bring out the best for you. So the lesson of this chapter, I think, is really simple. Don't just look at the wrongs done to you, and don't just look at the person or people who did the wrong things to you. Look for the bigger picture, because when you can see the hand of God in these things, then you can let all things work together for good, because you know and love him. Then you can have a forgiving spirit, and then you can also have an attitude of reconciliation. Now, I know that this is not the normal way we think. We usually, in ourselves, we want to get even. We want revenge. We want to cry out. We want justice. Sometimes we just want the people who've sort of sinned against us to be punished. But I think, in closing out this chapter, the thing is that we should be thankful that it gives us a reminder that God is sovereign in everything that happens. And nothing happens to his children without his permission, in the sense that he can make all things work together for good for those that love him. And my prayer is that the Spirit of God may make that a practical reality of this in your life and my life every day.